Catherine and Bill, welcome to the Relevate Podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
What a delight it is to be here face to face, capturing your story, because you two are such a beacon of hope for people who struggle. And I love the fact that you're not just keeping that inside, you are using your story to help other people. So that's where it gets really good in life. And I'm sure neither of you probably could have imagined this trajectory for your life. So let's just start in, and I'd love to know a little bit more. I mean, we're friends, we're all friends here, but I haven't really heard the story. So let's start with just a little background about you, Catherine. Ladies first. Would you like to start?
I'll start at the beginning and try and be brief. I am a Georgia native, and my father was a Vietnam veteran. After he retired from the Navy, he was a career Navy person. Things at my household really went downhill quickly. So I grew up in...
Did he have like PTSD?
He had PTSD, he had untreated bipolar and severe alcoholism. So, addiction is something that's been in my family for many generations. That's not unique to me, it's true with a lot of families, but it intensified after the war. And there was a lot of violence in my home and a lot of poverty, so I spent many years in a trailer in the southern part of the state and outside of Savannah. So that was those were my beginnings. I actually started drinking alcohol, which is a little ironic given everything that I had witnessed in my household, but that was one of the ways that I coped, and not knowing, the risk factors involved. It was kind of, that would not happen to me, I would be smarter. But I started at an early age to just deal with some of that anxiety and depression. This is all hindsight, you know.
Sure.
I didn't set out to say I'm going to treat my own mental health challenges with drugs and alcohol, but that's how I got started, and it escalated quickly. I drank. I was really high functioning in my drinking for decades, really, all through high school. School was kind of my escape. I was a cheerleader and an honor student, and I hid the fact really well that I was hurting. So we settled in a small little town outside of Augusta.
That you had a problem?
I knew I had a problem in that when I did drink, I tended to drink more than other people. But the people that I was around were also drinking, partying a lot, and then of course college, it became the norm. So it didn't really catch up with me until after college, when I had already gotten married and been divorced when I graduated college. And all the people around me that I'd been partying with kind of quit and started settling down, and I was still partying past the norm of everybody else. So I struggled for decades. Where my addiction affected me most was in relationships. So multiple divorces, which had an impact on my children. And I finally, in 2013, just made a decision because of health reasons, because I had been drinking for so long, that I was going to go to the hospital, and I went for medical treatment and stayed in rehab for a little while and started to get better. So the story definitely has a happy ending, but there was a lot in my childhood and within my family, my brother, my sister. It was a disease that definitely impacted our family, and though we lost our two parents to addiction, we are all in recovery. So now we're a family in recovery. So that's the good news. Yeah, that's the good news.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
Bill Whitney.
Yes.
My story is a bit of a contrast to Kat's. I grew up in Connecticut to a very, very well-to-do family. We had, from on the outside, what looks like all the comforts life could enjoy. My parents loved me. And, you know, as a little kid, things were pretty good. In fact, I would say they were idyllic. And then there was some upset in the family. My parents split up for about a year, a pretty impressionable time to me. And a couple of things happened, unfortunate things happened. And being at a vulnerable age, I didn't understand, you know, why my dad was gone. I thought I chased him away, and I was, I had some very, very difficult things happen to me, and I didn't have a way to process them. And for lack of a better explanation, I just decided that there was something wrong with me. And I, of course, like
And you were
said,
how old when this was going on?
I was in 5th grade.
Like 10?
Yeah, I think between the ages of 10 and 11, I had a couple of really important pivotal times that in my life that were turning points for me, and with no one to tell me that, you know, hey, this isn't your fault, or you know, I became very, very insecure, and of course I masked that. You know, I realize now, looking back at it, that was the beginning of a period of time where I was constantly, like 24 hours a day, constantly worried about how I looked, or how I appeared to the outside world. I was, you know, I felt unlovable. I felt like there was something wrong with me. I felt like I had to hide from everybody. So I put a lot of masks on really early and had to juggle the masks. And I didn't realize it at the time. I was an okay student. But after these things happened, I became far more concerned with being accepted than anything else. And so when I got into high school and first smoked marijuana, I didn't realize it at the time, of course, but I could be free from any kind of worry at all. And so, to make a long story short, I drank and used whatever you had until I was 47. And through that time, I managed to fake it, you know, to change masks and to get along and by any means necessary.
And to be high functioning in society.
Well, I think most people would describe me as high functioning. I thought I was a complete loser. I thought that I was a fraud. I believed that. I thought if anybody knew what was really going on in my head, they would. I don't know what I thought, but I just knew that I needed to not. I couldn't be okay with myself.
But you had a career in the military. Professionally.
No, I went to college for about 10 minutes, and they decided that, you know, you might want to go and grow up a little bit first. Academics didn't matter to me. I wanted my medication, and I wanted to be happy, and I became a little bit hedonistic in that respect. I didn't care. I just wanted to get high. I wanted to get out of my head. And yes, I was high functioning. I reluctantly joined the military because it turns out you can't get paid following a break that around New England. And I had a good career. I had remarkable experiences, and I was blessed with, you know, a reasonably good brain. So I did really well in the military. I resisted the structure, but it wasn't so much that I couldn't do whatever I wanted. So I still managed to party and got married to a wonderful woman who is now my first wife, my ex-wife, and the mother of my 3 kids, who were fantastic kids. But I was living a charade for a really long time. And then, you know, life went on, the kids grew up, my drinking really started to escalate in a big, big way when we moved to Missouri in '95. And that was the beginning of a 13-year run of real dependency. I was a pretty good, solid alcoholic, practicing alcoholic, just trying to sneak by any way I could until 2008. And after a divorce and quitting jobs and losing jobs, and I got invited to go visit my brother in February 2008, and he had been sober. So I'm the oldest of 5. I haven't mentioned this, and it turns out there's a pretty firm link in my family, on my mom's side of the family, to you can see alcoholism running right through that. My mom, both my grandparents on mom's side were alcoholic. My mom was, and all 5 of us kids are. And I might as well. This is probably as good a time as any to mention that 2 of us have gotten sober. One of us has. 2 of us are not, but they struggle. They get along, but they battle it. And we have a brother who just couldn't manage his life and took his own life last year. Fortunately for him, I think he's not suffering anymore, because I think he had a really extreme case of what I had in terms of the lack of self-worth. But in February of 2008, I went to Detroit. My brother said, "Come with me, we're going to hang out for the weekend." And he got sober before I did. So we did that. He took me to an AA meeting, and he took me to church. And we grew up in a church, but Jesus never came home. And what I mean by that is that Dad was an atheist. I found out afterwards. We went to church because it was a social obligation as a little boy. And so I mentioned the February in church in 2008 because it was the first time I ever felt the presence of God in my life. And I literally felt as though he was talking to me, and to say, I'm here and I just want to talk. And I remember that, and that was a turning point. So and I went to Jim's recovery meeting, and they were really amazing guys, and I was attracted to the selflessness of their service. And a couple of months later, I threw my hands down on a cold stove and looked up, and I said, "This can't be what you had in mind for me," and I put the bottle down for good. Called a friend I had met in a Bible study, and he said, "Meet me at this church Friday morning at 9 o'clock. You're going to be okay." And I believed him. So that was the beginning of my recovery journey.
Wow. So you didn't need to go to a treatment center.
I did not.
You didn't have to detox, or you did it through 12 steps.
Yeah, I was the kind of drinker who got drunk on the first one. And what I mean by that is I would drink the whole bottle. I would, if I took, as soon as I took a sip, I was off to the races, and I was going to end up asleep or passed out, depending on your definition. But I was going to get a high somehow. And the thing that really still blows me away is that my last night of drinking, I couldn't get drunk. I drank a whole bottle of gin, I drank a whole bottle of wine, and I couldn't get drunk anymore. I couldn't get out of my head. I couldn't shut down the voices in my head that told me I was such a bad person. No. So, and the human body is a remarkable thing. I didn't have to go into detox because there were lots of days when I didn't drink at all. I managed to keep myself in reasonably good shape. I like to bike and stuff. And so I'm certain that the first 6 months of my sobriety, which I don't remember well at all. No. It was just a long series of coming off alcohol primarily, and learning how to live in my head with all those things that were telling me all these awful things about myself. So I cried a lot. I went to a lot of meetings. I was fortunate because I had this little business that I'd started just before I got sober. So it was just me. And if it was the middle of the afternoon and I just couldn't stand the inside of my own head anymore, I would literally go find a meeting somewhere in Greater St. Louis and just get the heck out of there. So there were days, and I was fortunate in that respect. I would just leave. It didn't matter. And I wanted so badly to not be that way anymore, to not feel terrible, to feel like a loser, that I just said, the heck with it. I don't care if I end up in jail. I would much rather find some peace. I remember somebody said, I remember thinking to myself, the best thing I could get out of being sober would be a good night's sleep. That was it.
That's so amazing. Did your health ever suffer?
No, not yet.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I've been sober mercifully just over 12 years now, and
Wow, that's so amazing.
it really is. So, I have, I think, what are probably pretty normal 59-year-old creaks and complaints for my body registered regularly. But
Amen to that.
I think I'm just as fortunate as a man can be. We'll see. But
Yeah.
I'm active. I'm not as active as I want to be, but there's nothing I can't do.
Yeah.
Except maybe eat on the left side of my mouth. My teeth started to give me trouble. It's just funny. A long life is, I believe, a long life can be a messy thing, and it can be glorious in that respect.
Yeah.
And I think that's the path that, speaking for myself, I'm on.
So you both mentioned failed marriages and struggling with alcohol, and then you two found each other. So share a little bit about that story and how I know you both could have never imagined this.
Yes, well, you heard our upbringing were quite different. Me in Georgia and he in New England, and me in, it's not even bad, it was a horrible family life, and Bill not. So under normal circumstances, I think it would be a long shot for us to be together. I don't talk a lot about my addiction story so much because there's so much, I focus more on my recovery piece,
Sure.
and that's really was the hook that brought us together and how we stayed together. We can get into the fact that we both work in recovery, but we were at a leadership weekend. We were both participating in a 9-month leadership program. He in St. Louis and me here in Cumming.
Not recovery related.
Not recovery related. And it was a fluke. I was not supposed to be in Chicago for that weekend. I was supposed to be in Houston the weekend before, but I was scuba diving. So I ended up in Chicago by myself on the weekend that he was scheduled to be in, with his cohort. And I saw him. Bill's a very sharp dresser. He told you, he had a little business. He's actually a stylist and he designed men's clothing. So he was always dressed. So I noticed him from across the room, right? I was like, wow, that guy is really well dressed. And then we ended up in a small group together. And we were sharing, our most embarrassing story, something like that. And his, I won't tell his story, but
I brought a cop to an AA meeting early in sobriety.
Yes, so there.
With his lights. He came in behind me.
That's awesome.
So when I heard recovery, right? I quit in 2013, so this is year 7 for me. And we met in 2017? Yeah?
That's correct.
September 2017. So anyway, at the end of the group, I walked up to Bill, because it's really unusual in that setting, especially when it's a high-level training for people to talk about being in recovery. So I walked up to Bill and said, wow, I'm so glad you mentioned your recovery. I'm in recovery too. And Bill, being Bill, he's very quick. He said, hey, you want to go get a drink? And so that was really funny, right? And it was so in the moment, I couldn't get to a no. I was like, okay. So we went
I
out.
have to tell you, that was planned. It was totally spontaneous. That was somebody else's work.
Was it?
I don't know. I'm pretty sure I was not intending to be goofy. It just came out that way.
Well, it worked. We went out for a club soda, and it wasn't really a long story. The last day of the training, he texted and said he was saving me a seat. So I went and sat next to him. It was very clear that I was just in a place in my life and in my recovery because of all the relational disaster that I had been through. And it wasn't all disaster, but
But that was the focal point of our first date.
Yeah, it was like,
it doesn't work for me. I'm just not available. We're just having a soda.
Yeah.
Relax.
I'm not dating, I'm not available, you seem like a nice person.
You were saying that, Kat?
Yeah, like the whole time we were having this drink.
In the bar.
You could tell. Oh yeah, she wanted me bad.
It was just rejection after rejection, and he wasn't even really making
I wasn't even
advancements.
pitch.
So he saved a seat for me, and I said, can I borrow a pen? Very slick Bill. He pulls out a red pen. I don't know how spontaneous that was, but
Totally.
yeah, he said,
Well, it's getting late in this conference, and she's a special person. I mean, I'm becoming. I want to know. I don't want to know more
he
about
was
her.
desperate.
And I'm getting ready to jump in a car for 5 hours and drive back to St. Louis from Chicago, and she's going to get on a plane the next day, and I'm like, I want to talk to her some more. That's all.
Yeah.
So I gotta craft something, and I haven't got much to work with. So.
Well, he gave me
Take it
the
away,
red
babe.
pen, and he said, I'm going to let you use this, but you have to promise to return it in person. And that's slick. Yes.
Yeah.
And
Well,
so,
I did mention how special it was.
special.
The pen.
Yeah.
The pen was very important to me.
And actually, our first Christmas together, the ink had gone dry in that pen. He bought me a box of red pens in my stocking. So we have this connection around recovery and red pens. I don't know. But we've been together ever since. And the next year...
She doesn't have any jewelry as valuable.
Long distance relationship.
Yes,
for a
for the
while.
first almost year, we saw each other occasionally. So it was long distance. It gave us an opportunity to get to know each other in a way that I had not experienced before at a distance.
Mhm.
And
We became friends before we ever
became
kissed.
friends.
There you go.
That was a big deal.
Yeah, it was months before we even had a kiss. So, yeah, about a year later I had surgery, and Bill picked up his life and moved it here, which is a whole nother story in itself, all the things
And
that...
here is Metro Atlanta.
Here is Metro Atlanta from St. Louis, and the rust is yet to be seen. But so we've been together a few years. We got married the following year. No, 2018. Yeah, a couple months after my surgery in 2018, we got married.
Mhm.
So it's been almost 2 years.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Still newlyweds.
Still newlyweds. Yes.
Oh gosh, yes. We're still trying to navigate. We had a very tumultuous first 18 months. A lot of life changes. A lot of death, a lot of changes, a lot of, I had been sober and living by myself in a house by myself in Missouri for 10 years. And now I'm living in a house with 3 teenage kids, and their
Not
mom
easy.
is fully incapacitated for the first month that I lived there.
Yeah.
So it's tough for them too.
Yeah.
And
But y'all made it.
we've made it, and I really credit our recovery for
Yeah.
that. I mean, we've grown as a couple through that, where it might have pulled some apart. I think we've grown in that because of our recovery. So
100%.
we're both, from families in recovery, maybe from various things, but that has made the difference,
So
definitely.
cool. So before we kind of talk about the connection, which is where we are today, Catherine, you were very instrumental in making this place happen. So if you can kind of share what your vision was to bring an RCO to Forsyth County.
Sure. I told you I went to treatment in 2013, and when I left, because I've done multiple pathways to recovery, and what we mean by multiple pathways is that there's 12-step, there's faith-based, there's cognitive-based, so there's not just one way for people to get better. Bill's pathway was 12-step AA, as he told you, and mine was not. In 2001, in September, right after the 9/11, right after 9/11 happened, I went to my first AA meeting. I was really trying to save my marriage and I had small children at the time. And so for almost 5 years, I worked the program, I sponsored other women, and then I changed communities. We moved here to Cumming. within another relationship. I had divorced and so moved here to Cumming. And there wasn't a community that I could find at that time that wasn't a 12-step community, and that I had not been really successful finding a connection in coming to the AA community. Not that there was anything wrong, but I was isolated with small children at home. My husband was traveling, so I was isolated within my home, and I didn't know anyone.
Mhm.
So for full accountability, I just didn't connect,
Right.
And so that is really on me
Mhm.
in my recovery. I stopped working a program, as we would say. And so when I left treatment in 2013, after 7 years of really hard drinking and a lot of change, I went from 2 children to 7 children and more marital problems related to my addiction. It's like, we need a community here, it was a missing. So through a series of events, I went back to school. I'm a counselor since 2002. That's been my career. And I went back to specialize in substance use disorders. And I got a job here in Forsyth County at the accountability courts, which
Fun.
I cherish the time I spent there. But what I learned through that experience was that I wanted to connect with people not as a clinician, but as a peer in recovery.
Mhm.
And so I
Big
decided
difference.
to leave that job, kind of come out as a peer in recovery. And I had actually seen a film called The Anonymous People, where I realized that there was this big recovery advocacy movement happening across the country. And I located a big RCO here in Atlanta, which is the Georgia Council on Substance Abuse, and Navigate Recovery. There was a small network at that time of 7 or 8 of us.
And if you
And-
can just explain what does RCO stand for,
Sure.
and what is an RCO?
RCO stands for Recovery Community Organization, and it's just that it's a very grassroots, like a recovery. It's actually a community where people come together from all different pathways to recovery to maintain. Because what we know is that when you leave treatment, that was just for me, that was like step 0, which is stop doing what I'm doing.
Right.
But then recovery lasts the rest of our lives.
Sure.
So what I had learned from my experience is that, isolation did not work for me. I did not want to go backwards. So an RCO is a place where people in recovery, all from early recovery to decades of recovery, come together, support one another from a peer-to-peer perspective, doing social things. I mean, there's different types of RCO specific to the community.
Mhm.
But here in Forsyth County, that started in 2016. We incorporated the Recovery Community Foundation of Forsyth, and it was a totally new way of looking at recovery, because it wasn't, it didn't happen in a 12-step clubhouse or in a church. We actually had different meetings. We had an all-recovery meeting at the Kiwanis building. We had a Moms in Recovery at one of the treatment centers, and we had a yoga studio teach a yoga class for people. So it was, in the very beginning, it was a movement that was spread out.
Mhm.
And it wasn't until in 2018, right? Yeah, 2018, that we got funded and we got a physical space. And that's when things really started to take off, once everything was consolidated in one space. But RCOs are grassroots, for people in recovery, by people in recovery. And it's happening. We started out with 7 or 8 that I knew of in the state, and now there's more than 30. So it's really taken on. We're a constituency of consequence now, politically.
What does that mean?
That means that people, when someone has a health condition like cancer or diabetes or heart disease, there's advocacy that happens, right, for money for research. And so people who survive those things, like breast cancer, HIV/AIDS, they have their own advocacy movements where they get out and speak up and demand services and treatment. And that was not happening in the world of recovery. because of a lot of things, but mostly because of the stigma, and it's a shame-based illness, right? So when I say we're a constituency of consequence, people in recovery are stepping out of the shadows, publicly sharing our stories like this to let people know that recovery is really about hope.
Yes.
And that just like any health condition, we have a right to treatment, we have a right to services, and that's not going to happen if we don't demand it.
Yes.
So a big part of RCO, the whole recovery advocacy movement, is people coming out of the shadows and being proud, facing that, the stigma, addressing that. I have 2 master's degrees, and I own a home, and I vote, and I'm a person in recovery.
Right.
So we're not just those people who live in the shadows.
Right.
So.
And sharing those stories of advocacy and awareness, I think it's just so important. What you guys do as an RCO and helping people truly understand what addiction and recovery is all about. You put a face with it and a story, and it is so prevalent, and we're better when we address it together as a community, because on the opposite end of the spectrum, we have been in a pandemic of opioid overdose deaths for a number of years. We lose like 70,000 people a year to that. Plus, no telling how many others as a result of suicide and depression. So, the disease we're talking about is so very serious. And the solution that an RCO presents, it's so cost effective, it's so brilliant. The saying, the opposite of addiction is
Connection.
right.
Yes.
So it's having a physical space where people who are united in recovery can continue to work on themselves, to go to meetings, to go to sober social activities, to have fun, to volunteer, to be out in the community, to be united, to wear. Catherine, tell what the shirt says here, which is...
The shirt says here, "Because I got better." That's kind of... it came out of my story, and Rena, you're you know our language because you're a huge ally for people in recovery. So, but that's really why I think a lot of our peers do what we do, is because we got better, and we want to share the hope that it is possible. Now, it's not easy, but it's possible to get better. And my life in recovery was better, way better, than even before, I started using. I've had to kind of chip away, because quitting for me was just the first step. Then I dealt with my mental health challenges, which was the reason that I started. I had a lot of trauma.
And the two often go together.
They
right?
Very often. The majority of the time, there's an underlying condition, whether it is unresolved trauma, or some like depression, anxiety, some other mental health challenge. And going back to the opioid crisis, it wasn't until large numbers of, sadly, people died and are still dying. But what happened in a wave behind that is, as it hit wealthier communities, then parents started speaking out. There became that movement where people stepped out and said, we don't want to lose another child, and then the money started coming.
Right.
And so from that came places like The Connection. But it wasn't going to happen until we started stepping out of the shadows and speaking the truth, which is that we do get better.
Yes.
And we deserve to be heard. So,
Exactly.
yeah.
So it's fun to watch the evolution of kind of what's happened here. This place was really your vision. You got it started, you got it up out of the ground, doing great. And then you tossed it to
Bill.
Mr. Whitney, who is now the director here at The Connection, and doing a fantastic job, I might add.
We have
So
a lot
did
of
you-
work to do.
Did you ever envision yourself being the director of a nonprofit?
No, I did not.
Bill had a very successful career in men's clothing. And so for me to see that evolution into who he is today has been incredible, really incredible.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about what's going on here and your vision for the future for not only this RCO, but recovery in the state and maybe even the country, because I think what's happening here is really a model for the country.
I couldn't agree with you more. I really couldn't. Were some really, really, really important elements to the success of the recovery organization model that Catherine picked up on very obviously right away. And in so doing, she developed the mission and vision for the connection now in that process. And our mission is to empower recovery in our community. We do that by seeing people not as much where they are now. We'll meet them there, but when we meet them, we see them for what they can be. Because we have, and particularly speaking for myself, I have witnessed in the years that I've been sober, story after story after story after story of people who show up broken and destitute and just in horrendous circumstances, full of shame, full of self-doubt, full of fear.
Despair.
Yeah, fear. And the amazing thing about the work here at the Connection I've been able to witness and people bloom, literally bloom into lives that I think probably surprise most of them. Certainly surprises me what we're capable of, what is available to us when we suddenly realize that we can choose powerfully for ourselves to be empowered, to let others in, to help us, to understand that this shame only lives in our minds and that it's not really real. It's just a feeling. You know, we get in our own heads, and somebody once referred to the inside of my head as enemy territory, and I understand what that means now. We come out of that, and people in recovery are just exactly like everybody else.
Sure.
There are mental health challenges for a lot of folks that need to be dealt with, but the truth is that we're capable of exceptional things. And what's beautiful about recovery is that we reach a point in our sober time where we start to recognize that we have the power to do almost anything that we choose to do. And we have to do that by starting to own where we've been and acknowledging that there were some things that happened in my life that I'm not proud of, but I'm not shamed by them any longer. Yes. We let go. We turn our lives over to a higher power or to just the facts of what's been. And the fact is that when that happens, it occurs to almost all of us that there is a victory in that. We have overcome something extraordinary. And of course now, the vision that Kat developed as part of this is really where society at large can benefit. And that is this destigmatization, you know? By telling our stories out loud, not just to other people in recovery, but to other people in the world, because all of a sudden we're dealers of hope, and there's a lot of it, and it's in all of us. And that, for me, is what becomes the opposite of the fear that drives most of the stigma associated with people in recovery. It's really a fear of understanding. They just don't know what it's like. It turns out these people that used to be alcoholics or used to be, that have suffered from substance use disorders are just people who struggled through difficulties and overcome them, and then they show up in their lives with hope and with determination, and they show up with purpose. And that was what happened to me. And I found a purpose in the work that we do here. But make no mistake, we are a community who has learned how to be a stronger community, and it's a model for communities at large throughout the country, throughout the world.
And I think for just for human beings in general, what I find in my work as a clinician, and now I'm doing some things kind of spread out into the corporate world, which is a new arena for me. People in recovery, like, get it. And not that I wish that everyone had an addiction or had to recover from something, but I really wish that all human beings had the level of self-awareness that we have to keep. Like, it's a daily thing for me. And at the end of the day, to ask ourselves, if we're working a recovery program, did I harm anyone today? Is there anything I need to go back today and clean up? Is there anyone I need to apologize to? Is there anything I need to set right? We value time with our families because that was missing
Well, they're the ones
during
that
our
suffer during our
addiction.
addiction, right?
So it's, people in recovery really get it. I wish everyone were taught the recovery skills that we're forced to learn, you know?
So I'm not in recovery, I'm an ally, but I love my people in recovery for those very reasons. You know, it's like the level of transparency and vulnerability and just the willingness to continue to work on yourselves. I mean, that's a model for all of us.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
because we all have work to do.
There's a level of authenticity and
Yes.
vulnerability in the recovery community that is missing in a lot of other communities.
Right.
You know, and
Like
so
you kind of do the dance around. I'm like, I don't have time for that. You know,
Yeah.
let's get real.
we're real and it's raw.
That's it.
And people in recovery, they may not be openly in recovery, but a lot of them, you know, in the Senate and running the country and running businesses. And
I think I'm hearing more and more celebrities coming out. Oh yeah, I'm in recovery. You know, it's not like a big deal. It is just part of the conversation. Like Brene Brown. She is a person in long-term recovery. Her platform is not built around that, but it's built around vulnerability, right?
vulnerability and shame.
Exactly.
That's where her work started.
So,
I'm proud to be in recovery. You know, I can't regret what happened to me because now I have these tools and these skills and I'm able to make an impact in the world. Of course, I don't wish it on other people, but it has been a blessing in my life. Recovery has.
let's talk about how your respective families have healed as a result of your recovery. And Catherine, you especially, because you have such a beautiful, wonderfully blended family of biological children and adopted kids, and we can just talk a little bit about that.
Sure. I have a brother who was also a lifetime drug and alcohol user for a lot of the same reasons that I was, who's now in recovery.
And his name is?
His name is Stephen. He goes by Roscoe. Some people hearing this may know Roscoe. He shares his story all around the state. He works in residential treatment for men. Since he went into treatment, he stayed there and is now running or co-manager, something like that. I have a sister. I won't share her name, but she's also in long-term recovery for several years. So we're closer now. You know, our addiction really broke us apart. There wasn't a lot of communication for many years. But we're back together. Our children are now growing up together. My children, I did a lot of harm.
You have how many kids
I
total?
have 7 children. My youngest is 13.
That's an amazing number right
So
there.
they're 13, 14, and 15. They don't remember my addiction so much. But my older daughters, who are 21, 22, 24, and 25, it was very difficult on them. I think my 2 oldest daughters are adopted, so when their father and I divorced, that was a re-traumatization for them. And of course, my two biological daughters, who are now 23 and 22, lived through their teenage years where I just wasn't present. So from that, it's just been incredible for me. They were very supportive of me going to treatment. I have my younger children who come here and volunteer at the Connection. So this is a family program, and it took some time. I have a daughter, my 21-year-old daughter, I'm very proud of. She works with young people with disabilities. One of my other older daughters is a counselor. She just finished graduate school. So they're going into helping fields. But we're able to have hard conversations, and I think maybe a lot of families aren't there yet because of what we've been through together, because we know that if we're not communicating and we're not connecting, we're at risk, and they're at risk. So some of my children drink, some of them never have. It kind of runs, the spectrum. But none of them so far have experienced addiction. And if they do run into problems, they know they can come to me. Sure. There's no judgment. I cannot judge based on the things that have happened to me. So it's really about those recovery skills where we sit down and we talk things out and have some really difficult conversations. I think they've learned a lot about relationship through watching mine fail, but at the end, they're very gracious and forgiving. I think that my primary goal in my recovery is to continue to be a model for them, period. And to be available. There was a time when I was working earlier in recovery, then I realized that, I need to back off because I'm not present for my family. So I try and put that first in my recovery.
And that is why recovery matters so much. Because one person gets better, that family gets better, those communities get stronger. That's what it's all about.
That really is what it's all about.
It really matters that we pay attention to this.
We were at a ceremony last night, a completion ceremony for drug court. And the primary theme for me, there were 4 people who were completing the program. All of them had their families with them. And every person who got up to speak said, "Thank you for giving me my dad back. Thank you for giving me my mom back. Thank you for giving me my child back." It was so moving. A lot of those children will never know their parent has an addiction and will never have to live that. So the impact is so far-reaching.
To hear kids tearfully thanking the judge for the program and expressing with all of their hearts how proud they are of their parents is something you really have to see. It really is. The ripple effect of sobriety is extraordinary.
Yes.
And most of us think of the ripple effect. In my mind anyway, I'm a visual guy. I throw a pebble in the water and you see the ripples emanate from where the stone meets the water. Well, imagine you take hundreds of thousands of pebbles and throw them all in the water. It's rippling out all over society. By getting substance use disorders, alcoholism, addictions, out of the closet and into the mainstream, because almost everybody in America has been somehow touched by substance use disorder in some form or fashion. Employers, family members, friends, whatever it is.
Right.
And this ripple affects everybody.
Right.
Which is why this destigmatization vision is so important, because it affects our entire country. It infects our entire world. And if we can just get society at large to consider the possibility of finding similarities between people before we start poking at each other's differences, there's real hope in humanity for that. And that's what's so compelling about the long-term possibility of recovery. Everybody's recovering from something. We just don't always acknowledge it.
Yes.
I want to touch on the RCO is actually called the Recovery Community Foundation of Forsyth, and the Connection was funded in 2018 as kind of an offshoot of that. So that's the fiscal agent. there's a bigger vision for RCFF that's unfolding. The connection was kind of our first foothold, but Bill and I together, I guess, are looking at the possibility of creating businesses run by people in recovery.
Yes.
And creating housing, safe housing for people in recovery. So we want a wider scope. But the connection definitely is where we're starting, and I know Bill has a bigger vision for that.
Home base. Well, one last question for you both. So the word relevate means to uplift or inspire, to uplift or restore to good spirits. To uplift or restore to good spirits. In closing, what thoughts do you have for my listeners as it relates to recovery and that very message?
You're so good at that. You want to go first? What do you think?
I didn't realize that that's what relevate meant.
Yeah.
Uplifting with regard to recovery begins with a quick inventory back in your life to find the things that you still carry around. And we all do it. Our experiences drive us. They mold our fears and all this other stuff. And I think an important part of a successful uplifting for people, for communities, for any place, is to acknowledge that the past isn't today. It's just something we learned from. And that there's nothing wrong in this time and space where we stand right this moment.
Right.
But there is extraordinary possibility available to us if we let go of what was and start to join in community together to build what's possible. So for me, what recovery and Relevate, where they're linked, is in the notion that together there is possibility in places where there once wasn't even hope.
Yes.
And that's the essence of any well-lived life, in my opinion. Your purpose doesn't have to be grand. I think in a consumption society, we sometimes trample on the gifts that we all have, that the founding fathers of our country all pointed out. We are imbued with inalienable rights. And happiness is probably the biggest one.
Yes.
And that the only thing that keeps us from being happy is ourselves. We get to choose.
There you have
And
it.
we choose what's possible. And then we go get it, and then we really go get it.
Yeah.
And that's the
That's
juice.
where it gets good.
Then we link arms, and then we walk together, and we march, and we don't quit.
Yes.
We keep going, because we know this is possible. We know this is right.
Yeah, I want to, you spoke about our founding fathers and inalienable rights, and right now I really have to speak into recovery in terms of the racism in our country, and that's a whole different recovery process. So Relevate for me means to, as Bill said earlier, not to see people where we are right now. We really have to lift people up by seeing them bigger than they are right now. Really looking at people and being with people as bigger.
Yes.
Like when we empower people, we call them up to something greater than they are now. And I think if we practice those things, a lot of the divisiveness and the hurt and the anger and the killings and all of the things that we're experiencing on top of the pandemic, we can begin to address. So that's where, looking beyond recovery to addiction, my heart just feels like I have to speak on recovering as a nation from the other things that are underneath that we have not had the authenticity or the vulnerability to address. And the recovery community, if, we could link arms, in other arenas outside of the addiction community, the addiction recovery piece, and start having those conversations. So that's a goal of mine within my own family, is to start having those really hard conversations that make us uncomfortable, but to see us as a country bigger. We're bigger than we're being.
Right.
For sure. So.
Right. And it's one person at a time.
Yeah.
That's how we do it. It's linking arms with one person and saying, here, I got you, we're going to do this together. I got better, you can get better.
Yes.
That's how it works. That's God's economy. It's one person at a time. I think so many times we get overwhelmed by the bigger picture, because if you look at how many people are struggling right now, it's in not just with addiction, but all kinds of things. It's overwhelming, but be there for each other.
And then we can get better.
Exactly.
Things may seem really horrible right now in a lot of ways, but I still have hope. I think there's a deconstruction, and we're going to come out bigger.
Right.
So I'm so happy that you asked us to be here. Thank you.
Oh my gosh. Well, I love you both. I respect you both so much. Love the work you're doing in this space. And I think it is just, it's just going to keep getting better and bigger and better. And y'all keep preaching and sharing the good news that you do get better.
Thank you so much. And thanks for being a part of that with us.
Oh, sure. Yeah. My pleasure.
Yep.
Bye, y'all.
4 more years.